Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Drin Pintna, and I'm a project manager with the GBA. And today I'm joined by GBA members Karina Urquhart from BIC and Brian O'Leary from BISG. What you can expect from today is that we will go over some of the findings from the GBA surveys, and then we will discuss some of the implications, impacts, and opportunities associated with the results of the survey data. There will be some time for questions at the end, so
Yeah, I did think.
feel free to hold those until then or pop them in the chat at any time. Natalie, are you able to just mute all the participants except for me?
Yes, I'm on it.
So in 2020, BIC, BISG, and BookNet Canada formed the Green Book Alliance, otherwise known as GBA. As an early step, GBA surveyed the industry to better understand what steps towards sustainability had been taken by a range of supply chain participants. 2 years later, the GBA repeated the survey to evaluate progress areas, ongoing opportunities, and to get a grasp on what changes might be occurring in the areas of sustainability in book publishing. Essentially, we did a survey in 2020 and then we repeated the survey in 2024. Now, before we get into the results, I do want to point out some of the limitations of the survey to keep in mind. So our sample sizes were 70 and 55 respondents respectively. Methods of distribution were limited to word of mouth, social media, and email lists. And we were not able to control if respondents were the same or different in past and current years, which means this is not a direct comparison between specific companies, but rather two samples of the industry in general. There is even the bias of companies who are seeing our content and choosing to answer a Green Book Alliance stakeholder survey, as they may already have a vested interest in sustainability initiatives. So keep in mind this is not an exact science. That being said, there are some clear top-line takeaways which we are seeing in the survey data and that have provided us with some good insights into the current landscape of sustainability in book publishing. So these top takeaways are that we're seeing most changes are still being made for efficiency. We're not necessarily seeing a change in business models. Pandemic impacts are evident. So we're seeing both positive and negative impacts in regards to sustainability with respect to the pandemic. An increased focus on carbon, the need for targets in order to have commitment, and that overall things seem to be holding steady despite the disruption of the pandemic and moving in a direction with awareness and informed decision making. So overall, not bad. Let's jump into similarities. So these are things that were fairly steady between the 2020 survey and the 2024 survey. Both years, most respondents, so around 65%, said their company had an environmental policy or has committed to environmental goals. So this is quite consistent. In both surveys, the top 3 steps put in place to manage companies' environmental footprints were reduce material wastage, improve efforts to recycle materials, and lower energy consumption. So with material wastage being the #1 option, this is where we're seeing changes are maybe being made more for efficiency rather than, again, a change in business model. Also note that the improved effort to recycle actually decreased. So it was 70% in 2020 and then 60% in 2024. In both surveys, about half of respondents said they had staff working from home 100% or in a hybrid manner for a combination of reasons, including environmental ones. So this actually highlights a change. Having a high number of staff working hybrid or remote was likely brought about in part by the pandemic, but the fact that it has remained does highlight that, we're leaning maybe more into this, even though it's no longer as necessary. In 2020 and 2024, the top steps put in place to reduce companies' carbon footprints when it comes to the transportation of books were the use of print on demand, so smaller print runs and not overprinting, and printing locally where possible. And it is important to note that print on demand increased 10% from 2020 to 2024, so 50% in 2020 and 60% in 2024. But printing locally actually decreased, so by 10%. So this is potentially a pandemic implication, but it is positive to see that it does remain relatively stable, even though there was a 10% decrease in printing locally. Both surveys have very similar responses in regard to their company's use of green or sustainable energy providers. So we had about 20% of respondents say they use none, 20% said they use some, 10% said they only use sustainable energy providers, and 20% said they use sustainable energy providers primarily for power and electricity. And then the remainder of these responses fell under not sure or prefer not to say. Both surveys were consistent when it comes to companies who measure sustainability through KPIs or metrics, with almost equal responses between yes, no, and no, but we intend to. And this actually might flag attention to the need for targets in order to have commitment. With only a third of respondents currently utilizing KPIs, this does therefore present a potential opportunity. The use of non-biodegradable and or single-use plastics for respondents' companies was quite consistent. 6% of companies increased their use. 30 to 40% of companies said their use stayed the same, and that was an increase of 10% in 2024. So 30% in 2020 and 40% in 2024. 30% said they reduced by up to 50%, and 6% of companies reduced by up to 75% or eliminated, and this was the same both years. So we do see here that we are running the middle ground when it comes to single-use plastics, with lower numbers for increasing use and also for eliminating use. However, we see a net positive because most companies say their use is steady or that they are at least taking steps to reduce. Okay, so that is some of our key similarities that we have pulled from the survey data. And before we move into differences, I am going to turn it over to Karina and Brian, just with one question for you both about the similarities, which is how do you interpret the consistency in certain responses across both years? And maybe Karina, I'll get you to go first.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I think overall, if we're just looking at the survey, I think the consistency is encouraging. I think it reveals a continued and constant effort. And also it was encouraging to see that this year we had a greater mix of organisation types as well. So I think that in itself is encouraging. So those numbers are staying relatively consistent across a sort of a broader, fewer numbers, but a sort of a broader sweep of industry organisation types. I think it's clear that the industry is committed to reducing any negative environmental impacts where it can. And in some areas, though, I think I would have liked to have seen some improvements in the stats. We can come on to those in a minute, but I don't want to be negative at all, because I think it's generally a positive message. Also, let's not forget that none of this is easy. And many, as we know, many, if not all organisations are extremely time poor and workload heavy. And for many organisations and people within those organisations, this area is a new topic or relatively new. It's not something that has had to be included in their role specs before, for example. And I think there is now a greater awareness and a very clear desire to make a difference. I think, all the work we do with the GBA and all the work I do at BIC and with our Green Supply Chain Committee would sort of testify to that. I don't know how long of an answer you want. I can go on and on. I think what's interesting is the use of KPIs, and you've touched on it, and what I wonder is a relationship between the use of KPIs and having a goal or having a commitment to a policy or a goal. Because overall, there seems to be a slight uptick in organisations that already have a policy and or agreed goals, which is encouraging overall. But it means that approximately 32% of organisations don't have either of those yet. And 12% don't even have any plans to do anything. So that I'd like to look at that a bit more. I think that might be something that the GBA could look at in a bit more detail. And I'd like to better understand the sort of those barriers and the reasons why some organisations don't have either. What's preventing them doing that? And I think that goes hand in hand with it. Well, I'm guessing, but I suspect that might go hand in hand with the KPIs. So with only a third currently using them. So on the one hand, that's surprising. But again, if you look at the response to the policy and the commitment to goals question, it kind of isn't surprising. I just wonder if the two are maybe linked. I mean, we can't tell from the survey, but I just, I guess I'm answering your question with a question. So that's it. That was interesting. And the stats for sustainable energy use seem to be quite low still. So that's a consistency. And there again, I would like to explore that a bit more, because given the enthusiasm and the desire to improve things, I do wonder if organisations are perhaps stymied when it comes to those choices. If they're in a shared office, or if they're not able to influence the decision making around sustainable energy use. I don't know. That would be good to look into in a bit more use. And then the single-use plastics overall, as you said, that seems steady, which is good, but I wonder if we can do more here. It's encouraging. I had a closer look at the stats, and it's encouraging to see that 3.5% of the respondents this time have completely eliminated their use altogether, compared to 1.4% last time. So it's small, but it's definitely going in the right direction, which is great. And again, similar to the energy question, I wonder how much of that comes down to cost, to third-party actions, or simply a question of what materials are available, or maybe it's all three, or maybe it's something else altogether. And then finally, the continued trend for working from home is good. I think it's would definitely seem to be a carryover from pandemic days, and generally good for sustainability and for other reasons as well. However, in singing the praises of working from home, I would also like to just raise awareness. I'm sure I'm not saying anything new that anybody hasn't already thought of, but just to be equally aware of the need and benefits of face-to-face interactions and networking at all career stages, but especially for the career starters. I think that's something I keep hearing about. It's not necessarily as easy or as desirable for those that are perhaps new to their sort of working life, and I think it's important for organisations, and I'm sure I know many already do, to take steps and measures just to reduce feelings of isolation, and to in some way try and encourage a feeling of collaboration and teamwork. So they were my sort of initial observations.
And I think in looking at the results, particularly the similarities that you just described, I felt like there were positive signs for things that we know how to do, and some positive, but not as many positive signs about things that we're learning how to do.
Yeah.
And I put in the first bucket things that you talked about with respect to efficiency. So, reducing power consumption, reducing waste. These are things that take costs out of the system. They're easier sells. They can also be done sometimes by departments or by single functions within a business. So those are things that we've been trying to work on for quite some time, even reducing travel or working from home. While it has, certainly the pandemic plays a role in some of the early answers. the reality is it saves money if you're not traveling to book
Yeah.
fairs, going to see people in person. But I think there's not as much movement in the things that we don't yet know how to do. The things like setting KPIs, staffing around appropriately, and creating organizational goals. So the thing that struck me was when on the power answer with the 30% or so, so a third of the answers like I have no idea or I don't want to talk about it. And I think a lot of the answers were I don't know the answer because the organization hasn't made it clear whether or not it's done that. So if we get to the right person, we get the answer we need. And if you don't, the organization doesn't yet communicate. These are our objectives. This is what we're doing with respect to sustainability. So like Karina, I think there's an opportunity there to both better understand what's happening, but also communicate the importance of creating organizational level commitments rather than individual departments. So
I
go
agree.
ahead.
And I think to your point there, I think some organizations that I've spoken to, quite a few actually, anecdotally, of course, they want to do something, but they're overwhelmed. There's so much information out there, so many standards, so many certifications, so many methodologies, protocols, regulations, etc. I mean, you only have to go onto BIC's website, blatant plug here, to look at our accreditations badges map, where we've mapped out all of the schemes available, and there's loads. And it's I think especially when you're an SME, it's very hard to know which is the right one, which one should I be doing, and if I do that one, how am I going to do that, and who's going to help me? And it can be quite overwhelming. So I think
So maybe that's part of our charter for this point going forward is to break it down to make it. I know BIC has been doing this through its sustainability working group, but the GBA in other markets could be helpful.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and I think both of what you said is very insightful. And I think that is what we're pulling from the data essentially is that holding steady is a good thing, especially with how kind of chaotic the last couple years have been. Like the fact that we first pulled, this survey in 2020 does mean that, the fact that we are able to hold steady on some things in a lot of ways is progress, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't steps that we can be taking and there are clear areas where we could be doing better. So, with that being said, let us move into some of the differences. Respondents across both surveys were primarily publishers, so 60 to 70%, but there was an increase by 13% in respondents from manufacturers, paper or printing. Karina did mention this. So this makes the breakdown for 2020 70% publishers and 8% manufacturers. These are people who answered these surveys. And in 2024, it was 60% publishers and 20% manufacturers. So that's just something that's good to keep in mind when we're reviewing the data, that we do have a slightly different sample size or sample group. To reduce carbon emissions in 2024 compared to 2020, there was an increase in reducing travel by 19% and an increase in video conferencing by 13%. So reduced travel went from 34% to 53% of companies who said they were reducing travel. And video conferencing went from 55% to 68%. So in the 2020 survey, it was asked to consider a normal year and not pandemic scenarios. But this is a potential benefit of some of the pandemic practices, being that companies have more tools to accommodate reduced travel and increased video conferencing. Okay, so from 2020 to 2024, there was an increase in companies with no plans to carbon offset. So we went from 30% to 47%, so a 17% increase in companies who don't plan to carbon offset. So that is almost half of our surveyed respondents in 2024 who said they were not planning to carbon offset. There was also a decrease in companies currently carbon offsetting from 25% to 12%, so a 13% decrease. and a decrease of 10% of companies with no plans to carbon, sorry, a 10% decrease in companies with plans to carbon offset. So 18% of respondents, down from 28, said that they had plans to carbon offset. So we're seeing a real trend away from carbon offsetting, which is potentially a reluctance to invoke carbon offsets unless they truly reduce the overall carbon footprint. I think something just got popped in the chat, which is GBA's blog on whether carbon offsets is right for your company. But I will outline just a few key points from that blog, which is the benefits and limitations of carbon offsetting, because we don't necessarily want you to see this data and say, oh, everybody's moving away from it and it's bad. It's really the context in which it's being used. And I think the knowledge of this is maybe what is pushing this data that we're currently seeing. So, according to the World Wildlife Fund, carbon offsetting does not reduce emissions at the source, and purchasing offsets should be a last resort, with avoiding, reducing, and substituting being better options before offsets. Offset projects can range in efficiency and have been accused of overstating their ability to cut emissions, and therefore having the potential to have a bit of a greenwashing effect, which obviously is not something that companies want. For a company, it is important to also think about that there's not necessarily a return on investment, which could come from long-term internal sustainability initiatives. So you're not necessarily having an ROI when you're purchasing offsets that with, internal initiatives you could find. On the flip side, it does help environmental projects that can't necessarily secure funding on their own. And it also allows for companies to do more in reducing their carbon footprint, in that it is better than inaction. So essentially, it is neither necessarily good or bad, it's simply a tool. And it is dependent on if companies are, reducing their offsets but not taking any other sustainability initiatives, or if they're being intentional to reduce offsets or to reduce their carbon footprint using offsets and also doing other things as well. So, okay, in regards to paper, from 2020 to 2024, there was a 14% decrease in the use of certified 100% post-consumer recycled paper for printing books. And note that post-consumer recycled paper has a higher carbon footprint. There was an 18% decrease in not sending out unsolicited paper marketing material. This is probably a post-pandemic increase, as there was not really anyone to send things to in 2020. A 13% decrease in paper for manuscripts, books, and royalty statements sourced from a certified forest management system, and that is potentially an opportunity. So it does appear that companies are making more informed decisions, and that potentially carbon impact and greenhouse gases is being used as a main filter. Finally, we have seen a slight increase in 2024, so only 7%, for organizations with a department or person with overall responsibility for their sustainability agenda. However, this is truly a net positive because it went from 49% to 56%. So although the increase is maybe slight, this remains, and it does remain an ongoing opportunity. This 7% has pushed us to over half of companies surveyed having internal structures dedicated to sustainability. So 56% of companies surveyed in 2024 have a department or person with a responsibility for the sustainability agenda. So that brings us to the end of the differences. So now we've seen a little bit of what has held steady and what has changed. And I'm going to turn this back over to Karina and Brian. I have a couple of questions for you, both on the differences and overall. First off, what do you think are the most significant trends or shifts in sustainability efforts? Or I guess trends that just encouraged or surprised you within the book publishing industry based on the survey findings?
You want me to? Why don't I kick off? I was pleasantly surprised around the offsets data. there's some comments in the chat that I agree with, that there could be multiple causes for it. And there is some controversy around the value of offsets that has been covered. BIC has been trying to be pretty careful about documenting schemes that are would be considered valid for publishers. But I think it shows a level of sophistication thinking around sustainability, that people aren't simply buying or trying to buy offsets to get to a number, but rather thinking maybe this isn't the right strategy for us. So I was encouraged by that. The other thing I think that somewhat surprised me, but I was happy about it as well, was the growth. It's 7 percentage points. So on a base of almost half, a 15% increase in the number of companies that were reporting having somebody on point for sustainability. I don't know if 56% is a tipping point, but I do think it's a commitment. Money kind of tells you where you're spending your time and energy.
Okay.
Absolutely. Karina?
Yeah, so similar to Brian, really. So in terms of trends and what we're seeing, the increased use of POD and printing locally, I think that's a trend that's going to continue for a variety of reasons, not least environmental. Also smaller print runs, smarter ordering as well, you would hope result in fewer returns and therefore less wastage generally. So the sort of the positive knock-on effects of that as well. So not just about the carbon footprint, although obviously that is important. I think I'm encouraged to see the reduction in travel. I think the reduction in unnecessary travel is very encouraging, and the greater use of video conferencing. I think that again is a hangover from the pandemic that's here to stay. But I will refer back to my earlier point about that let's not underestimate the value of a face-to-face meeting. But I think people now are doing it in a more considered way, which is good. And similar to Brian, I think it's encouraging to see a reduction in general carbon offsetting. I say that not because I'm a fan necessarily of offsetting, but I say think because I hope, and I think Jaren, you touched on it, I hope it corresponds with a preference to increase efforts to actually reduce carbon emissions in the first place at source, rather than simply sort of buying the offsets to sort of do it that way instead. I don't know. I don't think it's possible to tell from the survey what the actual reasons for that are, but I'm trying to be optimistic and thinking it's because the positive actions will be taken elsewhere in terms of actively reducing the carbon emission first. I think there may be a place for carbon offsetting. Don't want to completely write it off, because there may be those occasions where you simply cannot do anything about that final piece of carbon emissions that you have either directly or indirectly in your supply chain. But I would exercise caution and say it should only ever be considered as a very last resort and after extensive due diligence has been applied.
Yeah, and there's a comment from E.J. Hurst from New Society and who notes the importance of following due diligence when getting the offsets.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Adds their own experience of trying to buy locally so they know what's actually happening.
That's it. And some schemes, we're not talking small amounts of money either. So it's definitely a considered purchase all round, really. I'm not surprised to see an increase in organisations with a dedicated person or department for looking at all things sustainable. And of course, the term sustainable or sustainability encompasses many different things, not just, I say just inverted commas, the environment or carbon. So I think that's going to be here to stay. And I can talk a bit more about that later on. I am and I'm not slightly surprised to see an increase in the sending out of unsolicited paper materials, and I wonder how much of that is as a result of post-pandemic. I'd like to understand the reasons, the real reasons behind that a bit more, I think, as well. And that sort of calls into question the digital marketing piece. Is digital marketing any more environmentally friendly? I think that's a whole other conversation as well. So just like to explore that a little bit more, I think, because, you know, marketing has to be done. I just would sort of like to do a deeper dive there and better understand that. I think a very good trend, I don't think you mentioned this, Jaren, was a 13% increase in organisations asking environmental questions of their trading partners and suppliers before agreeing to trade with them. So I thought that was brilliant to see that, really encouraging. Although the decision on whether or not to trade with them, depending on their answers, hasn't really changed much from sort of 3-4 years ago, but really encouraging to see that more organisations are asking those questions. So they were my observations there.
Amazing. Thank you both for that. Okay, my next question is, with the increase in organizations having a dedicated department or person, which I think you touched on, Karina, with the responsible for sustainability, what role do you see internal structures playing in driving sustainability agendas forward in the coming years?
Yeah, so I've had to think about this one, and I think there are combinations of factors that will and do influence sustainability agendas. And there are numerous agendas as well. You've got your organisational agendas, then the agendas of that or your organisation's trading partners as well. And then you've got the agendas of governments, legislation, both in your own country and internationally. And as a global supply chain, our industry, it needs to ensure awareness of the requirements both at home and abroad. And then there's the question of not simply complying with legislation, but also responding to social pressures and factors. And these can come from numerous sources as well. So from within an organisation, as well as externally. So for example, authors, consumers, and so on. And then of course, you've got your general social responsibility, regardless of legislation as well. So in answer to the question, I sort of rambled on a bit. In answer to the question, I think it's a synergy of all the above. I don't think it would necessarily come from a department. And I think over the coming months and years, we'll see roles within the industry expand and change and evolve, and we'll see new roles coming in as well, perhaps roles that we haven't even thought of yet at the moment. Of course, larger organisations can structure more this way, but we shouldn't forget the smaller organisations either, who perhaps aren't able to. And when I say smaller organisations, you know, we all know there are publishers out there and teams of 2, 3, 4, 5 people. However, some of these areas, smaller organisations might be able to benefit from sort of the learnings and developments and progress made by the larger organisations. And I think that's where collaboration across industry is key here. And this is where neutral organisations like the GBA, BISG, BookNet Canada, BIC, etc. come in. I think we're going to see more sustainability roles. Advertisers have already touched on that earlier. And also where organisations don't have dedicated departments, I think we'll be seeing current roles having to absorb sustainability work. And I think that's already, well, I know that's already happening. And I am expanding a bit on your original question, I do realise. And I think we'll see an increase in sustainability legislation inevitably, both now and in coming years. And I think that will require increasingly specialist knowledge, expertise, etc. Not just in our industry. I mean, this will be happening not just in our industry, but in all industries. the increase of, legislation, EU directives. I can reel off a few now: EUDR, CSRD, EU CSDD, EU Forced Labour Directive, EU Digital Passports, greenhouse gas protocols, etc. New guidance for greenhouse gas accounting in forest, land use and agriculture, or FLAG, to name but a few. So I think we will be seeing changes over time in sort of types of roles, types of departments within organizations.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you've said there. And the thing is, we can't know from the surveys exactly why some of these things are occurring, but based on what you have said in terms of there is more legislation coming in, and it becomes not necessarily just companies saying like, we really want to do more, but we have to, and we need a sustainability person to keep up with all of these things that are being expected of us. And it does become a question of labor, especially with smaller organizations. It can be harder in that way. Brian, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I echo a lot of what Karina's already put into the conversation, but I would add that one thing that concerns me is that in a number of cases, it feels like the people who are being put into the roles as sustainability coordinators or sustainability leads are there to answer questions that are being asked. We had an example in a webinar in February that the GBA put on, where somebody from a printer was just saying, well, we were getting so many of these requests and we were being very slow. We weren't really answering them in an effective manner. That's not a bad thing, but that's somewhat different from an organizational commitment to sustainability. So I think we'll have to think through what that means for what does it mean for an organization to be committed to leading on sustainability or making it a core part of their business along the lines of what Karina was describing. Because if the people that are being assigned these roles are also responsible for reporting and doing the kind of the nuts and bolts work that comes with the job, it kind of creates those silos I was worried about in answering your question from the first part, which I don't think we want. We really want to build sustainability in as a core part of how you think about book publishing, and to have a mid-level staffer kind of assigned that responsibility is probably not realistic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I think it needs to be woven, as you said, Brian. Sustainability needs to be woven, whatever that looks like, needs to be woven into your organization from the get-go.
Right. I mean, and either that or empower the folks who are in those mid-level positions to speak for your company, which is would be a big change culturally in some organizations, and certainly would be different within book publishing historically.
Yeah. So I think that moves us nicely into my last question for you both, which is, how is the GBA going to respond to the results of this survey? Brian, do you
We're
want
having a party.
We're going to do another survey.
Yeah,
I've got lots of
fortunately,
questions.
we're doing. Well, we've got one thing that we've been working on the checklist project, which I think we've been successful in bringing to market. But you've proposed, Jaren's proposed a rebranding, because the checklist is not a checklist. It's really a guide for conversations between publishers and their printing or manufacturing partners. That's a good thing. But our notion was going into it that we did not want to be prescriptive. I do think that there's a need to be more prescriptive with respect to reporting and data collection, in part because we do want to be, as an industry, responsive to that alphabet soup of initiatives that Karina described. I mean, it's a vast array, and so figuring out a way to make that manageable for the constituents of the supply chain in book publishing is part of our thinking, so that we can be responsive in sustainability, but also collect data that tells us what's going on in a meaningful way. So we have a project that we're kicking off this month to look at sustainability reporting, with the idea of putting together a conversation on the Tuesday before Frankfurt Book Fair in Frankfurt to just examine what we could do to make that reporting, data collection and reporting work better. That will be more specific than what we currently call the checklist, but it also probably will be more invasive in the sense that I can hand you a checklist today and you can decide when you use it or which parts of it you use. Whereas if we come up with a standard or a recommended approach for data collection and reporting, that's going to have an impact on a lot more companies at a deeper level.
Definitely. Karina, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I totally agree with what Brian is saying there. I would like to have a look at, Brian, you may hate me for saying this. I would like to have, if possible, do something around exploring alternatives for single-use plastics, just to see if there's any signposting we can do, or if there's any investigative work we can do, and just to really understand what the barriers there might be, because obviously I think, you know, we're sort of guessing what those barriers might be, so would really like to explore that a bit more.
And BIC has been leading the way in that regard, in terms of things like the design for recycling project that you took on. I think you have insight there that's worth following.
Yeah, so sort of would like to sort of build on that once that project's finished. And then I think, again, investigate the barriers to having an environmental policy or commitment to goals. Is it as simple as, you know, organizations just being time poor and overwhelmed and just needing a bit of a steer on what that is? And could that go hand in hand with the sort of standardizing reporting that you mentioned there, Brian, already, which I won't repeat? Yeah, just feels like a missed opportunity there to not have at least goals sort of bedded into an organization in some way, even if it's just one goal. So I'd like to understand, I'd like GBA to sort of find out a little bit more about what those barriers might be.
Right.
Yeah, and then as usual, you know, the avoiding duplication, making sure we're not sort of doubling up on work that's already been done elsewhere, because we're all about efficiency, and continue to share and collaborate and talk to each other. Yeah, just to continue the conversation, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Brian and Karina, thank you so much for those insights. I think that is really helpful in, like you said, you know, continuing the conversation. So on that note, we do have some time for audience questions. If anybody has any questions that they have about anything that we've said, or if you want us to go back and revisit any of these stats or dig a little deeper into anything, please pop those in the chat. While you think of that, I will just repeat some of our core takeaways from what we've talked about today, which were that we are seeing the changes made for efficiencies, and that there is room to make more changes in business models, that I think we were able to extrapolate, you know, pandemic impacts quite evidently. There is an increased focus on carbon, which I saw in the chat there was quite a lot of comments on. And so I think that holds quite true. That targets are important for commitment, which is definitely an ongoing opportunity, because we're not necessarily seeing the commitment to targets, which therefore isn't translating into commitments to sustainability. But that the very positive note is that generally this survey held very steady compared to the 2020 survey, and a lot happened in those 4 years. So despite the disruption of the pandemic, we are moving in a direction with awareness and informed decision making. Okay, we have from the chat, might we consider including booksellers in our next survey? I think that
Definitely. I think it went out to as many people as we could find.
yes.
Yeah, I mean, booksellers were not excluded, but the number of booksellers responding to the survey is limited. I think we doing a more aggressive job, I think would be a good idea.
Would you mind if I just spoke to that really briefly? I run a bookshop in Leicestershire in England, and I also work with the Booksellers Association of the UK and Ireland. And I've just been named their sustainability champion, and we're about to reanimate the sustainable bookselling group. So I guess I would have been one of the 7%, of in increase of people who are championing sustainability within their businesses, if would have taken part. And this is the first call I've ever been on with you guys, so I'm really thrilled to have found you and to have heard about all this incredible work you're doing that I didn't know about, a month ago. And if there's anything I can do to increase the uptake by booksellers in the participation of the surveys you're doing, just tell me and I will do it, and insist upon 1,000 booksellers in the UK taking part in your surveys, because talking about best practice, of course, we all have so much to learn from each other across the industry. So if I can be of any help in that respect, I would love to work with you guys on it.
Brilliant. Debbie, if you're a member of the Booksellers Association, which it sounds like you obviously are, you are members of BIC already. So have a chat with Meryl. Meryl's on our Green Supply Chain Committee. So have a chat with Meryl and maybe we can get you on board that way. I know that's BIC, not GBA, but that's how we can sort of continue that conversation. Definitely loop you in to the GBA piece as well, for sure.
Perfect. Thank you, Karina.
Absolutely. I was just going to say, Natalie, I think you have our contact info. If you could just pop that in the chat now for everybody. Thank you. Yeah, anybody who even has any follow-ups for this later on or final thoughts, like please do reach out to us. We would love to hear it. And if you have ideas for collaboration, like that's truly what GBA is here for, is to kind of stand as this, middle organization. Okay, the question just was the 2020 survey conducted pre or post official pandemic lockdown. It was end of 2020 and then bled slightly into early 2021. So it is like quite in the deepest, I think, part of the pandemic that we sent this survey out. Another question we have is, when we look at changes to business models rather than just efficiencies, what are you imagining there? Brian, I think maybe you had some comments on this. Sorry if you
Sure.
don't.
So, I mean, I think the comment that I made earlier, particularly with respect to similarities, is that we are focusing on things that we understand first. I'm not necessarily proposing that these aren't important things to do, but they're within our wheelhouse, and they also tend to be things that are single function in nature. Something that would change a business model. We had it was not a GBA webinar, but we did a session with Klaus van Krogh and Andreas Stopperup from 2K Denmark to talk about changes in typography. They came up with a font that they felt could save, for argument's sake, 18 to 35% of the pages that would be printed. So that's a change in the model per se. I mean, rather than simply working with the fonts that we've had in the past. But I don't think any of that really happens until we have a good sense of what the measurement that we're not doing right now means for for our carbon footprint. Most companies don't really have a good sense of. They might have scope 1 and 2 kind of sorted out, which is why you see a focus on things like travel and efficiency and reduction of waste. But the scope 3, which is in the paper and the volume stuff, which is probably some high percentage, 70 to 90% of the total emissions for a book, still isn't being measured effectively. We can be helpful in that regard. That's why we're working on the projects that I described. But I think that first you get there, and then each company is going to make decisions about what's important and what they need to do to get to a better target.
We have another question here, which I think has been partially answered in the chat, which is just a shift to more remote work seems as though it would complicate the question about whether companies are using green or sustainable energy providers, as workers are using the energy providers that they choose / that are available to them at home rather than what is selected for use at the office. is there a way to accommodate that in reporting and goal setting? And then New Society has stated what they do. And I think that it has also been noted in the chat that there are methods for including remote worker GHG emissions in an organization's carbon footprint. And I think there are a bunch of, I think, helpful links that have been posted in the chat there. I don't know if either of you had any more comments about remote work, or I think that's been
I think it's
fairly.
already been answered.
Yeah, I defer to the Noah's answer in particular. BookNet Canada does report every year on greenhouse gases, and its workforce right now is entirely remote. So they know this, and EJ as well, providing information about how they try to calculate that. I mean, the thing globally is that these are generally smaller numbers, but the more efficient and the greener your energy sources, the lower your footprint's going to be.
Okay, I think we'll give it maybe another couple minutes to see if anybody has any other questions. I don't know if Brian or Karita, you have any kind of final thoughts on this. And the other thing that I just wanted to, an email list of everyone for follow-up networking. Brian or Karita?
We can't, not the UK arm of GBA can't because of GDPR. We're not permitted to share email addresses, unfortunately.
Yeah, we could create an opt-in list that would, people would have the option, but we can't do it from this meeting.
Yes, I thought that was the case. What I was going to ask is if participants in this meeting, if you had any thoughts rather than questions about, I think we've had some great even answering of questions right directly in the chat about either one of your best sustainability practices or hacks that have really helped your company, or one of your biggest problems that you're having. Because I agree, some follow-up networking would be great, and we can see what we can do to facilitate, like maybe an opt-in list. But if anybody has any thoughts on what we have talked about today, or that has really, you felt has reflected what you're experiencing within your company, we would love to hear that as well. Oh, and popped in the chat has just been, I think, GHG inventory.
And one thing we'd be remiss to not point out that BookNet, BISG, and BIC as separate organizations all maintain some degree of way to get involved in the work. Generally it's membership driven, so BIC and BISG in particular. But if you're based in the United States and you wanted to be part of the BISG Sustainability Working Group, which actually met just an hour ago, we're happy to talk to you about it, and particularly if you have a subject matter expertise that you want to bring to that conversation. And BIC, I think you're always looking for people to do work. So.
Same if you're based in the UK, or you trade with the UK, and you'd like to get involved. If you're not already a member and you'd like to think about that, and keen to join our Green Committee, or you don't have to join the committee, you might want to take part in projects, just let me know. Drop me a line.
Right.
We'll share email addresses with our email addresses with the participants afterwards, will we? Is that?
Yes, we'll do that in the follow-up email.
Okay.
One thing I wanted to just throw out before we lost it was that there was a brief comment from a bookseller about the number of advanced reading copies that they receive. So clearly there's a market. There's a value in providing physical copies to the trade. And we're not going to just change that overnight, but maybe creating greater awareness about what happens to those, and whether or not the volume and the breadth of distribution still makes sense might be an opportunity for us as well.
Yeah, although I did see some encouraging stats, I don't have it to hand now, of the use of digital proofs and galleys, etc. being used, which was encouraging as well. But again, that throws up the whole question of digital footprint. versus digital
Right.
carbon footprint versus physical carbon footprint, which is a whole other webinar.
Yeah.
Well, it's a whole nother study. I think
Certainly is.
we were talking about that in the Sustainable Working Group
Yeah.
meeting an hour ago. So it's
Yeah. It's more than a
that's
webinar.
an important topic, more
Yeah.
than a webinar.
Absolutely. I do think even in my personal experience with that I've gotten such different feedback from people within the industry. Some people say, I think we just have a comment right now saying 95 get recycled without ever being read. That's an unfortunate stat right there. Some people say everybody's tired of looking at screens. Nobody wants to read like an EPUB, and the paper books are necessary. Others say we don't even read them, so if you're going to send them, you might as well save on mailing them to us, and then we just recycle them anyway. I think maybe, again, yeah, probably another whole study, but even having that conversation and just having a greater, yeah, awareness of what people like booksellers are looking for, what different supply chain, the lack of communication within the supply chain is going to be the downfall of sustainability. I think, that's oh yeah, we have a comment there. Rather be sent an ARC. I asked for it then. So specifically that unsolicited ARCs being, I think, an issue there.
Yeah.
Okay, that just
June,
about brings us. Sorry, Brian, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you for putting this together.
Oh,
Yes,
of course.
thank you.
Well, thanks to both of you. I was going to say, Brian and Karina, thank you very much. And Natalie, for all your back end help. Thank you to everyone who has come today and everyone who will watch this recording. GBA's info is right there. So if you do have any follow-up questions, comments, or are looking to collaborate, please do reach out to us. And otherwise, thank you for taking this time today.